This is my case study presentation for EDL 854. So the first thing we need to do is look at what the facts are in this situation. And so when we look at what has happened, due to district fundraising structure or funding structures, the Briardale president, Mr. Barely, has organized a raffle where participants purchased tickets for an opportunity to win cash. So, due to the funding restrictions in the district, the money that comes from the district can only be used for basic school funds. Any additional money for things like music, art, any supplemental curriculum needs to come from the foundation's fundraising. And so Mr. Barely organized a raffle where participants purchased tickets for an opportunity to win cash. On the night of the raffle, in front of the principal, Mr. Santos, and members of the community, Mr. Barely was arrested and charged with a misdemeanor for his role in the raffle. In addition to the criminal charges and the probation sentence, the fundraising disaster was on the front page of the local paper. The foundation's reputation has been marred, and Mr. Santos has been personally embarrassed. So, what are the order of the events, and where did they happen? So, at the beginning of the school year, a parent was chosen to lead the foundation. The parent, Mr. Barely, is new to the school community. A former fraternity brother of his, Mr. Morley, was elected the president of the foundation at another building. At the orientation meeting, which was typically held, Mr. Santos, the school principal, reviewed the responsibilities with Mr. Barely. Fundraising responsibilities, his role as the president, and then also communication with the school curriculum committee. Several of these did not happen in this situation. So Mr. Barely was inspired by his fundraising experiences at Harvard, and he organized a raffle for the foundation where people would purchase tickets in exchange for an opportunity to win cash. The foundation was told about this and supported it. The night of the raffle, as the first ticket was drawn and in front of Mr. Santos and the community, Mr. Barely was taken to the local police station by the sheriff. An anonymous individual had alerted the sheriff to the illegality of the raffle. And it's interesting that someone was aware that the raffle was illegal, but chose to not inform the school or the foundation, but instead went straight to the sheriff. So Mr. Barely was convicted of a misdemeanor and sentenced to probation. The local paper printed a story about the budget and fundraiser fiasco. Mr. Santos is personally embarrassed, and the reputation of the foundation is permanently damaged. So we also need to look at who's involved in this through the school building. So really, in terms of the school, I think it's important to note that the school and the foundation are two separate entities. Mr. Santos, the Briardale school principal, is confident. He has faith in his own abilities to lead a building, including managing a budget. He did not directly oversee the fundraising activities conducted by the foundation. He is surprised when the sheriff arrives at the fundraiser, which, shows that he's unaware generally of what's going on with the foundation. And it's resulted in him being personally embarrassed by this disaster. When we look at the teachers, there's not a lot of information on their opinions, but I think it's important to note that across the district, teachers don't leave. This is a district where teachers come and stay. They spend their careers there. And so while it's not explicitly stated that the school is like the district, you can kind of infer that the school staff is in the same, mold as the district staff. And then finally, there's really no mention of district administration or BOE members other than, noting that the superintendent provides funding to the schools and then what that funding needs to be used for by the administrators. But I can just, I think it's safe to assume that those individuals are not happy with this situation. especially since it was such a public way. So then we need to look at the community and what are the individuals in the community. So first, it's important to note Mr. Barely. He is now the former head of the foundation, new to the community. You know, I think you could say that he was motivated to provide programs for the school, but he was really motivated to raise more money than ever, especially since his former college rival was the president of another foundation. That leads me to say he's competitive. He's overconfident in his abilities because he obviously didn't check to see if his fundraiser was legal. He's been convicted of a misdemeanor. He's been sentenced to probation, and he is personally embarrassed. And now we need to look at the Briardale Foundation members. And so, they supported Mr. Barely's proposed raffle fundraiser. And so that leads me to believe that, there weren't a lot of procedural safeguards in place. It would lead me to think that there's not a formal governance structure, or probably some stringent bylaws with rules, regulations, and processes beyond, just the president position. So I think we also need to mention Mr. Morley, who is the president of another foundation in the district. He's a former fraternity brother of Mr. Barely, which would lead me to believe that he's familiar with the raffle fundraiser that was done at Harvard. He's competitive with Mr. Barely, and I truly believe that he is the anonymous tipster who was aware of the illegality of the raffle. And instead of notifying the foundation, Mr. Barely, or the school, he chose to inform the sheriff. We also need to note the community at large, which is generally supportive of the school, but they also utilize the facility on a consistent basis. It's a meeting space. It's a venue for special events, including a spelling bee that brings in around 1,000 people from the neighboring areas. So they are supportive of the school, but the school also meets a strong need in their community. So now we need to look at the legal and ethical issues in the case. Has anyone been harmed in this situation? No one's been physically harmed, but there have been some pretty severe damage done to some reputations. Also, a situation like this, even though the foundation is different than the school, it's hard to separate those things in the mind of the community. And so this situation also reflects poorly on the school and the school district. The students are harmed because they were relying on funds from the fundraiser to pay for supplemental curriculum. It's also going to impact staff. And honestly, depending on the response from district administration and the board, Mr. Santos's job could be in jeopardy. We need to look and see if the situation breaks existing laws. And since Mr. Barely was taken to the local sheriff's station, booked, convicted of a misdemeanor, and sentenced to probation, that's a pretty easy yes. Existing laws were broken. Was there a breach of contract? So there's not a formal contract, but I would say there's an informal contract, an expectation that the funds raised by the foundation will be available to pay for supplemental curricular activities at the school site. And with this not happening because of the debacle, those funds will not be available. Additionally, if the people who purchased tickets need a refund and money that was taken in has already been spent on other items for the event, the foundation could actually be in a hole at the end of this. So in a single sentence, what is occurring? In a very long sentence, in his competitiveness, an overeager school foundation president organized an illegal fundraiser, which has resulted in the president being arrested and convicted of a crime, public embarrassment for the principal and the school district, and finally, a loss of needed monies for the students at Briardale School. So now we need to look at the facts. What do we know and what don't we know? Let's talk about the people. We know that Mr. Santos believes that he has the knowledge to run a school, including budgeting. He's supportive of the community using the building. He accepts the fundraised money from the school foundation, and then he uses it to implement supplementary curriculum in conjunction with the foundation's recommendation and the school site curriculum committee, which follows district protocol. We don't know how much involvement he had with the foundation after he met with Mr. Barely at the beginning of the year to review, just for a simple orientation. I think it's pretty easy to assume that there was not much involvement from Mr. Santos. And honestly, given that those are two separate entities, I think that's a really fine line to walk for an administrator. For Mr. Barely, we know that he's conducted an illegal fundraiser. He proposed the idea to the foundation. His goal was to beat Mr. Morley's fundraising and everyone else's. And he also wanted to provide programs beyond what was traditionally offered. And I think this is interesting because district protocol states that the foundation president needs to, communicate with that school site curriculum committee before they want to do anything that's going to impact the supplemental curricular programs. Well, there's no notes that Mr. Barely did that. So that's a procedural safeguard that he missed, because if he had done that and someone on the committee said, hey, we don't need this, we don't want this, it could have tempered his goals, or it could have led to some questions about how he was going to raise the money. And then someone who was more knowledgeable than him in this area could have pointed out some of the flaws in his plan. We honestly don't know, though, what involvement he allowed from other members of the foundation. I think we can infer that he just took this on and did it himself from lots of different ways. Honestly, the strongest one is the fact that he was the only person who was taken to the sheriff's office that evening. And so I think, again, that's a safeguard that he did not have in place to prevent this from happening. So let's talk about the building. Briardale Elementary is one of 6 schools in the district. It's in the center of town, and due to this, it functions as the community meeting center. It's got a population of 600 students and a mostly veteran staff. A committee of staff members makes decisions on curriculum, specifically the supplemental curriculum that the foundation raises money for, and that committee is headed by a teacher. So curriculum and instructional strategies throughout the district focus on basic skills. Funding is placed in the school budget by the superintendent, and then that money must be used by the principal to fund the basic skills curriculum. And then that supplemental curriculum is funded by the foundation. We don't know how additional funds raised by the foundation compare to funds raised by the other elementary schools in the district. So we don't know where Briardale, how it compares to the other 5 elementary schools. We also don't know what the district charges for community facility usage. And this is important because later when we talk about how this situation could impact the community, if the school wants to keep the programs, the money has to come from somewhere. And if you've got a facility that's being used consistently by a lot of different things, the district could start charging for that usage to raise money. And then that kind of leads us into the third thing we don't know, and that's what other avenues are available to the school to raise funds for those programs. So now we need to talk about the program, which in this case is the foundation. We know the general duties of the foundation president. We know that the foundation has a successful history of funding those programs with the pre-existing fundraisers, art, music, PE. We also know that the foundation was supportive of Mr. Barely's plan. What we don't know is the leadership structure of the foundation beyond president. As I've been involved in parent-teacher organizations, there's been a president, a vice president, there have been co-treasurers, a secretary, teacher representatives. And so really in that, there are a lot of redundancies and procedural safeguards and internal controls to prevent one person from having too much power and unchecked influence. So that kind of leads us also into, we don't know what or if any procedures or bylaws are in place for the foundation. I can't imagine that you would have a foundation at a school site without bylaws, but it's really what is in place to make sure that illegalities don't occur. And then we also don't know what fundraisers the foundation has used in the past to raise the money for those programs. Now, obviously, the raffle was a new idea. What worked in the past? Now we need to look at the school district. 6 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 1 high school. Each elementary school has between 500 and 800 students. The high school is well known for its winning football program. There's a curriculum that focuses on basic skills, and then that's supported by both elementary objectives that emphasize that skill instruction, as well as the fact that the superintendent provides funding to each building, which then the building administrator utilizes specifically for those basic skills curriculum. It cannot be used for anything else. We also know that the current funding formula for those supplementary curriculum subjects, it's opaque. It's hard to understand. It's murky. And so this creates a high degree of competition between the schools for community dollars. We don't know what the current funding formula looks like, and that's almost by nature of its design. And we also don't know the leadership structure of the district beyond school principals. Is it just a direct jump to the superintendent? In my mind, a district of this size would have assistant superintendents and some directors and other, central office leadership to help. We know some information about the community. We know that the community is diverse and overly supportive of the school. The facility is utilized as a meeting center for the town. And, it's also noted that the community was at the fundraiser. They were at the raffle. And while you don't really know if that's because they were excited about the raffle and something new, or if they're just consistently at those fundraisers. The other thing we don't know is how the community is going to react to this. I mean, is the community going to reject the foundation because of this situation? Is the community going to, tie the school and the foundation directly together? And part of that then is like, what messaging is going to come from the district about this? What messaging is going to come from Mr. Santos about this? And how it all just ties together. And so in this situation, we know the events have led up to this debacle. We know what's followed in terms of publicity and then also consequences for the people involved. Here's what we don't know. We're not told specifically where the school district is, and so we don't know what specific laws or state statutes were broken by Mr. Byerly. We don't know the district's policies and procedures regarding fundraising, internal controls for monies, procedural safeguards. We don't know the bylaws or the leadership for the foundation. And we also don't know how schools and foundations interact with other buildings in the district. And I think that's important to know that, because if you're going to look at revamping and reworking processes, it's good to have an example so you don't have to build something from scratch. So what are the priorities in this situation? The situation is going to damage the school due to a loss in funding. The students are going to be impacted because they most likely will not have access to that money. I was speaking with Derby's director of finance at one point in time, and he made the comment that a school district isn't like a business. You can't make more widgets to bring in more money. You've got a set amount of money. And so just because Briardale School lost the money from the foundation's fundraising, that money just doesn't magically appear from somewhere else. And so, the other piece is that this problem could go on for a couple of years. Once something is damaged and once trust is broken, it's really hard to regain that. And so people could be less willing to give money to the foundation because of what's happened in this instance. It can damage the community by negatively impacting the quality of education students receive at the school. And then the other way this could impact the community is if the school isn't going to raise money, able to raise money through fundraising, are they going to start charging facility usage fees? If there's an all-day fundraiser or an all-day spelling bee, how much money could that bring in to the school? So we also need to look at who has an important stake in the outcome. And really at this point, Mr. Barely, his outcome has already been predetermined by the law. So I didn't really include him in this. Starting first and foremost with Briardale students and staff. That I talked already about the loss of that money. Students will have less access to curriculum options, and not knowing exactly how these programs are staffed or when they're scheduled, staff members could lose supplemental pay. They could lose, pay outside of their contract day. They could lose their position entirely. If there are less supplemental programs, you can assume that it's going to be a challenge to get teachers their plan and prep time. And that's another thing to consider in this. Mr. Santos has a stake in this outcome. He needs to really be able to fix this and show, not maybe fix it himself, but show that he is going to take some steps to address the outcome, because it could have an impact on his career. And then, finally, the Briardale Foundation has an important stake in the outcome. Their reputation has been stained. And while, it would be easier for someone to say, Mr. Barely's the one who did this, he went off and did this on his own, the foundation still did not hold him in check or have the safeguards in place to make sure this didn't happen again. So there are some other things. I felt like there was a lot that I really would have liked to have known about this situation. I'd like to know what existing law was broken by Mr. Barely, and really look at the state statutes related to school-related foundations holding raffles. The procedures and policies the district has in place for fundraising, the internal controls regarding cash collection and ticket sales. And then, honestly, the other piece is participation in school work by individuals who have been convicted of a crime. I mean, if it's a misdemeanor, does that mean that Mr. Barely is permanently barred from serving on, in any capacity? And I'm not proposing that he should, but I do think it would be something to know. And then the other piece is those internal bylaws and procedures for the Briardale Foundation, an executive board structure beyond the president. Right now, I'm president of our teachers union, and it's not just me, because there's no way it could just be me. When I was president of my son's elementary school's PTO, it was not me, because there was no way it could just be me. And then finally, the relationship structure between the foundations and school administration and other elementaries in the district. And so even with those questions, do I have enough information? And yeah, I've got enough information to identify options, evaluate a couple of them, and pick one, and then develop a plan to implement my decision. So what are the options? And I developed two. The first one would be to dissolve the foundation and bring its activities under direct control of the building administrator. I almost feel like this is the quicker option, but I'm getting into evaluating it. In this option, Mr. Santos would dissolve the foundation in the aftermath of the mess, and then basically just incorporate that work into his own arena with the help of the school site curriculum committee. That committee would be expanded then to include more parents who had been part of the foundation, but ultimately the control would fall to the school. Option two is to work closely with a new foundation president to repair the foundation's reputation, but the key part is without taking over the work. So, Mr. Santos would work with members of the foundation in an advisory role as they took steps to repair the reputation. I think it would lead to an increased presence at the foundation's work by Mr. Santos, but ultimately the control would still be their own hands. When I've sat in on PTO meetings. I've not ever been at a PTO meeting where the building principal wasn't there. I mean, unless there was a family emergency, and then they definitely checked in afterwards to see what happened. And so it's surprising to me that, there's a large gap in this between Mr. Santos's involvement, between Mr. Santos meeting with Mr. Barely and then Mr. Santos showing up at the fundraiser. So let's look at the pros and cons of each option. I know that I've already done that a bit. In option 1, the pros are that the school would have direct control over both the work of the foundation and the money generated from that work. By eliminating the foundation, you could say, well, yeah, the reputation was damaged. There was some things going on that weren't right, and so we got rid of it. There are some pretty strong cons there, though. Doing that could really alienate parents and other individuals who have donated to the foundation in the past. Because while there are some safeguards that could have been put in place to prevent his actions, really we are looking at the actions of one representative. And granted, with the approval of other representatives of the foundation, but this is not necessarily something that was planned en masse. It would also be inconsistent with practice across the district. And then finally, this would ramp up the workload for both teachers on the site curriculum committee as well as Mr. Santos, and that could lead to increased burnout and more teacher turnover. And that would be really impactful then on students in another way. So pros for working with the foundation. The foundation would continue, hopefully, with stronger internal controls in place. That permanent increase to workload for staff members isn't going to be there. And then you can still engage and involve parents. The con is that it's not a quick fix. It will take some time. So it probably will not come to your surprise that after reflecting and evaluating and going through the options, I'm going to go with number 2. And so we want to implement the decision. I found this process to be interesting for this case study because, I truly do believe that these entities need to remain separate. Even though the amount of support that the foundation provides to the school is different than what I'm used to seeing in my own district, I still believe that they need to be 2 separate entities. And so Mr. Santos, as an administrator, doesn't necessarily have as many steps and as much hands-on involvement in implementing this decision or this option. So the first one is that the foundation needs to identify new leadership. They need to select a new president using their typical process. At this stage, Mr. Santos should not insert himself into this situation. He just needs to let it play out and see what happens. The foundation needs to do its work, but in the meantime, he can be prepping to advise and work with the new president. He needs to familiarize himself with the foundation leadership structures at other buildings in the district. If there aren't strong examples there, expanding that to organizations across the state or even nationwide examples, and then doing the same with bylaws and procedural safeguards. So the next item, once there's a new president identified, Mr. Santos would need to meet with them. And really, I believe the agenda would need to be expanded. So again, talking about the role of the president, fundraising, the importance of collaborating with the school site curriculum committee. And so I think when you look at these 3 things, these are 3 areas that Mr. Barely failed in. While the role of president so far has not been clearly defined for the foundation, in terms of having a specific set of duties and who you contact and who you collaborate with and who you assign other duties to, that's all part of being president of a foundation or an association. And Mr. Barely, from the case study, seems to have taken an entire piece on himself that he shouldn't have. He was not equipped for the task. Fundraising would be a very timely item to talk about, considering the situation that has led to the new leader. And then also the importance of collaborating with the school site curriculum committee. I talked a little bit about that earlier, where that's a step that Mr. Barely did not do. And if he had, it could have prevented a lot of pain in this situation. Whoops. And so kind of all this, Mr. Santos at this point would I sit and kind of say, okay, this is what wasn't done. So how are you going to fix it? You're the president. What are you going to do? What are you going to put in place? I'm more than happy to advise and be a sounding board, but these are the things that didn't happen before, and these are the things that need to happen. So the next step for Mr. Santos would be to attend and participate in foundation meetings. Once that leadership team begins meeting, Mr. Santos will attend those meetings, and not necessarily to be an active participant, but really at times just to be aware of what the foundation is doing and being there to provide that principal perspective. He could ask parents who are also staff members to sit in on the meeting as well, kind of in that goal to have as many people participating as possible. And that could serve as his presence will be an additional procedural safeguard if the foundation deviates from standing district protocols again. And so really, once the foundation is back up, once they've established their procedural safeguards and their bylaws, it's time for them to raise some funds. The community needs to be engaged in a fundraiser. They need to set reasonable goals. They need to lean into something they know has been successful in the past. And this is an opportunity for Mr. Santos to use a little leverage. The school is the community center meeting space. And so it's a natural place for the fundraiser to be held. And so Mr. Santos, I believe, should say, okay, if you want to use my space, if you want to use the school for the foundation's work, here's what I need to see. I need to see a written plan for the event and the format of the fundraiser, including documentation that the event is legal. I need to see procedural safeguards for the collection of the money. What are your internal controls? And then finally, I want to see documentation of the collaboration between the foundation president and that committee. I mean, it can just be minutes from a meeting, but it needs to be there. So, that is really, in terms of the direct problem, that's really the last step. But then I do think we need to address the fact that there are some underlying causes that led to this, even beyond the foundation. And so to me, I think in the future, it would be really critical that Mr. Santos bring up a need to clarify the formula for the supplemental curriculum. It needs to be more transparent. It needs to be easy to understand and to work through. And so, the other thing I wonder about this system that they use is if you've got a diverse community, a community that's economically diverse with high income and low income areas, you're going to have some severe inequalities between buildings if you're relying solely on what's brought in by a building to fund those programs. So just looking at those two things, I think would be helpful to prevent something like this from happening. Competition is not bad. Competition is good. But in this situation, competitiveness and also, I would say, motivation really did lead to this situation, or at least contribute to it happening. So, really finally, I do believe the option will provide the best path forward because it's going to maintain the foundation as a viable fundraising entity for the school, but it'll encourage those additional procedural safeguards to be put in place. I strongly believe that a foundation's control should be in the hands of parents. You know, we talk about engaging the community, we talk about engaging stakeholders, we're talking about giving families a voice. And to me, items like PTOs or foundations and fundraiser generating entities, site councils, that's where parents can naturally slot in and join with teachers and have a voice in their students' education. It's a good first step. And it also brings in fresh ideas into a building. I will say, though, that it really only works when there are strong bylaws, processes, and procedural safeguards. They have to be in place to prevent a situation like this from happening again in the future. So I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my presentation. I've learned a lot in this course, especially considering that this is a topic I had very limited knowledge about when we started. So I appreciate everything in the course. Thank you.